The evening sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of Evelyn James's homestead, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath her rocking chair. At first glance, she appeared as fragile as autumn leaves, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her weathered hands folded quietly in her lap. The townsfolk of Dusty Creek often whispered about the widow who lived alone on the outskirts, their voices a mix of pity and curiosity. The homestead itself stood as a testament to better days, its faded paint and time-worn fence telling stories of a life once shared. Inside, a single plate sat at the dinner table, a stark reminder of Thomas's absence. 3 years had passed since she'd buried her husband, but the emptiness still echoed through the halls like a phantom. In town, the saloon buzzed with the usual evening crowd, rough men drowning their troubles in cheap whiskey. A stranger sat at the bar, his clothes too fine for these parts, his ears catching fragments of conversation that drifted through the smoky air. "Poor Widow James," a weathered ranch hand muttered, "out there all alone since Thomas passed. Ain't right for a woman her age." The bartender leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Heard the black vultures are moving into the territory. Been picking off easy targets one by one. Women like that living alone." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with implication. The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly, studying the amber liquid in his glass. Through the dusty window, he could see the last rays of sunlight painting the town in shades of blood and gold. Dusty Creek had changed since he'd last passed through, the streets emptier, the faces more guarded. The black vulture's reputation cast a long shadow, and good folks knew better than to stand in their way. Back at her homestead, Evelyn sat quietly as darkness crept across the land. To anyone watching, she appeared lost in thought, perhaps remembering happier times. But there was something in her eyes, a sharpness that belied her fragile appearance. As she gazed out at the horizon, her fingers absently traced a pattern on the arm of her rocking chair, following grooves worn smooth by years of the same motion. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and with it, whispers of trouble brewing. Evelyn had lived long enough to recognize the signs, to feel the shift in the air that preceded a storm. But what the town didn't know, what no one had bothered to discover, was that this seemingly vulnerable widow was far more than she appeared. If you think this is intense, just wait until you see how Evelyn handles what's coming next. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I bet we've got viewers from all over who can't wait to see what happens when the black vultures make their first mistake. The black vultures made their camp in an abandoned silver mine just outside of Dusty Creek. Inside the torchlit cavern, Silas Crow lounged on a makeshift throne fashioned from stolen furniture and saddles, his dark eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. At 45, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who took what he wanted and made others pay dearly for defiance. "Tell me more about this widow," he drawled, cleaning his nails with a wicked-looking knife. The scout he'd sent to town shifted nervously, aware that delivering anything less than useful information could cost him dearly. "Lives alone, about 3 miles out. Place is well maintained but isolated. Husband died 3 years back, leaving her with a decent piece of land. Word is, she's got savings tucked away somewhere." The scout paused, then added, "Folks say she's private. Keeps to herself mostly." A cruel smile played across Silas's scarred face. "Sounds perfect. Been a while since we had something easy." He stood, his impressive height making others instinctively step back. The firelight caught the silver snake emblem on his vest, the gang's signature mark that had become synonymous with terror across 3 territories. Around the cave, 24 men lounged on stolen furniture, cleaning weapons or gambling away their latest spoils. They were a hard lot, each chosen for their brutality and absolute loyalty to Silas. The gang had grown from simple highway robbery to a sophisticated operation of extortion and violence, leaving broken lives and burning buildings in their wake. "That land of hers," Silas mused, pacing now. "It's got good water access, doesn't it?" The scout nodded eagerly. "Perfect spot for our new base of operations. Close enough to town to keep them under our thumb. far enough out to spot any law coming. From the shadows, a voice spoke up. What if she won't sell? It was Cole, Silas's right-hand man, younger and hungrier for violence than even his leader. His face bore fresh scars from their last negotiation with a stubborn ranch owner. Silas laughed, the sound echoing off the cave walls like broken glass. Oh, she'll sell. They all do, once they understand the alternative. He turned to address the gang, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through blood and fear. We'll start small. Show her what happens to property when it's not properly protected. Then, when she's good and scared, we'll make our offer. The men chuckled darkly, already anticipating the familiar pattern of intimidation and violence that had served them so well. But Cole remained thoughtful, his finger tracing the grip of his pistol. Might be fun to take our time with this one, he suggested, his voice carrying a hint of something that made even some of the hardened criminals shift uncomfortably. Silas nodded approvingly. Tomorrow we will pay the widow a visit. Let's show her what happens to folks who don't have proper protection in these parts. He raised his bottle in a mock toast to Widow James, about to learn the true meaning of loneliness. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when hoofbeats shattered the dawn's silence. Dust clouds rose like angry spirits as the black vultures approached Evelyn's homestead, their horses' shoes striking sparks against the scattered rocks of the dry earth. Silas led the column, 6 of his most intimidating men spread out behind him like a dark wave. Evelyn stood on her porch, a simple blue dress hanging loose on her thin frame, one hand resting on the wooden railing as she watched their approach. If the sight of armed men bearing down on her home caused any fear, her weathered face didn't show it. She remained still like a photograph frozen in time as they circled her house. Mrs. James, Silas called out, his voice dripping with false courtesy as he dismounted. Hope we're not disturbing your morning. His spurs jangled against the packed earth as he approached the porch steps, touching the brim of his hat in mock respect. You are, Evelyn replied simply, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. State your business and be on your way. The gang members exchanged glances, unused to such direct challenge. Cole's hand drifted to his pistol, but Silas waved him down with a subtle gesture. Now, ma'am, that's not very neighborly. We've come to discuss a business proposition. Evelyn's eyes, sharp as winter frost, studied each man in turn. I don't do business with vultures, she said, the words falling like stones in still water. Silas's practiced smile faltered for just a moment. Ma'am, you misunderstand. These are dangerous times, lots of bad folks around. He spread his hands in a gesture of false concern. We're offering protection, for a reasonable fee, of course. Protection, Evelyn repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Her gaze drifted to the horizon, where heat waves distorted the landscape. My husband once told me something about protection, said the most dangerous predators are the ones that promise to keep you safe. Silas's facade of politeness cracked. Your husband ain't here anymore, is he? He sneered, taking another step forward. Lady like you all alone. Accidents happen. Fires start. Animals go missing. Unless I pay you, Evelyn finished, her voice unchanged. Then, something shifted in her expression, subtle as a shadow passing over the moon. Tell me, Mr. Crow, do you know what a precision instrument can do at 800 yards? The question, so unexpected, made Silas pause. For the first time, he felt a whisper of unease, though he couldn't say why. There was something in the widow's stance, in the way she watched them, that didn't match her fragile appearance. You're making a mistake, Mrs. James, he warned, backing toward his horse. We'll give you time to reconsider, but not much. He mounted up, gesturing to his men. Think carefully about our offer. We'd hate to see anything happen to this lovely home of yours. As they rode away, Evelyn remained on her porch, watching until the dust settled. Only then did her hand, steady as stone, release its grip on the railing where, hidden from view, her fingers had been pressed so tight they left marks in the wood. That evening, Evelyn descended into her cellar, a lantern casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. She moved past shelves of preserved food and farming tools toward a corner that hadn't been disturbed in years. There, beneath a false floorboard worn smooth by time, lay a wooden chest that held more than just memories. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the box's edges, not from age or fear, but from the weight of what lay within. As she opened it, lamplight gleamed off well-oiled metal, a Springfield Model 1863 rifle as familiar to her hands as a mother's touch would be to a child. "You always said this day might come," she whispered, memories flooding back like a broken dam. The year was 1863, and the Civil War raged across a divided nation. While most women tended to the wounded or managed homesteads, Evelyn had a different calling. Under her husband Thomas's guidance, she had become one of the most lethal sharpshooters the Union had never officially acknowledged. "Steady your breath, Eve," Thomas's voice echoed from the past. She remembered the first time he'd placed the rifle in her hands, how he'd recognized something in her that others had missed, a natural talent that bordered on miraculous. "The rifle is just an extension of your will. You don't pull the trigger, you release the shot." They'd met when Thomas, a renowned marksman himself, was training specialists for long-range reconnaissance. Evelyn had been working as a nurse, but her keen eye and steady hands caught his attention. What began as secret lessons evolved into both partnership and love. Deadeye Eve, they'd called her, though few knew her true identity. Operating miles behind enemy lines, she'd made shots that became whispered legends around campfires. 800 yards through morning mist to save a surrounded patrol. 1,000 yards at dusk to prevent an ambush. Each impossible shot added to a reputation that remained anonymous. Evelyn lifted the rifle from its bed of oiled cloth, muscle memory taking over as she checked the action. "A precision instrument," Thomas had always said, "is only as good as the hand that holds it." After the war, they'd built this life together, finding peace in the quiet moments between sunset and sunrise. But Thomas had been wiser than she'd known. "The world doesn't forget how to be violent," he'd warned her, insisting they maintain their skills even as they built their home. Every morning, before the sun rose, they'd practice. Every evening, they'd clean their weapons with reverent care. When illness took him 3 years ago, she'd packed away the rifles, thinking that chapter of her life was closed. But Thomas had known better. "Someday," he'd told her in his final days, "you'll need to remember who you are. Not just a farmer's wife, not just a widow. You're still Deadeye Eve. And there might come a time when the world needs to be reminded of that." Now, as she held the familiar weight of the rifle, Evelyn felt the years falling away. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was becoming something else. Something the black vultures would soon learn to fear. The attack came just before midnight. Evelyn was awake, sitting in darkness, when she heard the first sounds of hooves approaching. Through her window, moonlight caught the glint of metal as riders emerged from the shadows, their faces covered with bandanas, moving with practiced stealth toward her barn. The crack of splintering wood echoed across the yard as they broke down the barn door. The sounds that followed were deliberate, methodical. The destruction of property meant to instill fear. Glass shattered as rocks flew through windows. A torch arced through the air, landing in a hay bale that quickly caught flame. From her position in the darkened house, Evelyn watched with an eerie calm. Her fingers didn't tremble as she counted the men. 8 this time, more than before. Cole led them, his voice carrying across the yard as he urged them to make it count. The fire spread quickly, turning night to day as flames consumed the barn. The horses inside whinnied in terror, but Evelyn had already moved them to the back pasture, anticipating this very scenario. Her preparations hadn't stopped there. "Check the house," Cole shouted, emboldened by the destruction. "Leave her a message she won't forget." 2 men approached her front door, boots heavy on the porch steps. The door wasn't locked, another surprise for them. As they pushed it open, expecting resistance, they found only empty rooms and silence. Evelyn had already slipped out the back, moving like a shadow through terrain she knew by heart. From her position behind an old oak tree, she watched them ransack her home. Their confidence grew with each room they violated, each possession they destroyed. "Not so tough now, is she?" one of them laughed, tossing her china through a window. The precious plates, wedding gifts from a lifetime ago, shattered on the ground below. But Evelyn didn't flinch at the destruction. Material things could be replaced. Instead, she memorized faces, noted patterns of movement, and analyzed their tactics. Her mind, sharp as ever, cataloged every detail with military precision. When they finally rode away, whooping and shooting into the air, they left behind a scene of calculated devastation. The barn still burned, casting an orange glow across the property. Her home stood violated, windows broken, furniture destroyed. Only then did Evelyn move. She walked slowly across her yard, past the burning barn, through her ransacked home. In her bedroom, she knelt beside her bed and pulled out a leather bag she'd prepared days ago. Inside were ammunition, dried food, medical supplies, everything needed for what would come next. Last, she retrieved her rifle from its hiding place. The metal gleamed in the firelight as she began to clean it, her movements precise and practiced. This wasn't the frantic preparation of a frightened woman. This was the methodical readiness of a soldier preparing for battle. "You wanted to send a message," she spoke softly to the empty room, her voice carrying the weight of years of training and experience. "Well, I've got one for you, too." Dawn found Evelyn moving with purpose across her property, her mind recalling battlefield strategies from years past. The morning light revealed the full extent of the gang's destruction, but her focus wasn't on what was lost. It was on what was to come. "Every piece of ground can be a weapon," Thomas's voice echoed in her memory as she surveyed her land through a soldier's eyes. The rolling terrain that had once seemed perfect for farming now presented different opportunities. Each dip, rise, and cluster of rocks became a potential advantage. She began with the obvious approaches. In the narrow paths leading to her property, she carefully arranged fallen trees and debris, creating a natural-looking funnel that would force riders to take the path she chose. "Control the battlefield," Thomas had taught her, "and you control the fight." The old grain silo, standing tall against the morning sky, would be her crow's nest. From there, she had clear lines of sight to every approach. She spent an hour reinforcing the ladder inside, ensuring she could move quickly and silently when needed. Behind the burned-out barn, she dug shallow trenches and covered them with brush. Not deep enough to harm the horses, but sufficient to throw off any rider moving at speed. "Make them fight the ground as much as they fight you," she murmured, remembering lessons learned in Virginia's bloody fields. In the house, she moved with mechanical efficiency. Furniture was repositioned to create cover while maintaining clear paths to every exit. Windows were partially boarded, leaving gaps just wide enough for her rifle barrel. Every room became a potential firing position, every doorway a possible escape route. High in the rocks overlooking her property, she established her final position. Here, 800 yards from her house, she could command the entire valley. She carefully arranged her ammunition and supplies, including her old spotter's scope from the war. "Distance is your ally," Thomas had always said. "The further away you are, the more time you have to think." She checked and rechecked the wind indicators she'd placed, strips of cloth tied to branches at various distances. They would tell her everything she needed to know when the time came. As the sun climbed higher, Evelyn paused to study her work. To untrained eyes, nothing would appear different about her property. But she had transformed it into a carefully orchestrated killing ground, where every approach concealed a disadvantage for the unwary. In the afternoon, she began her practice runs, moving from position to position, timing each route, memorizing every step in darkness. Her aging body protested, but muscle memory from years of training took over. "Age doesn't matter," she told herself, "when every move is deliberate." By sunset, she was ready. Sitting on her porch, cleaning her rifle one final time, Evelyn felt a strange sense of peace. The frightened widow the black vultures thought they knew had vanished. In her place sat a warrior who had once made history without ever entering the history books. "Come then," she whispered to the gathering darkness. "Let's see how you fare against a real vulture." The black vultures came at dawn, their approach heralded by the distant thunder of hooves. This time, Silas had brought his full force, 20 riders armed to the teeth, confidence fueled by memories of their previous night's destruction. But Evelyn was already in position, high in the rocks overlooking her property. Through her scope, she watched them approach, their arrogance evident in their loose formation and casual pace. They expected to find a terrified widow, perhaps ready to surrender after their show of force. "Let's see how brave you are," she whispered, adjusting her sight for distance and the slight morning breeze. The first shot would set the tone for everything that followed. The gang reached the narrowed pass she'd prepared, bunching up exactly as she'd planned. Silas led them, his silver snake emblem catching the early light. Behind him, Cole rode with a torch, clearly intent on finishing what they'd started with her barn. Evelyn's finger rested lightly on the trigger, her breathing slow and controlled. "Release the shot," she murmured Thomas's words. "Don't pull it." The first rider never knew what hit him. One moment he was scanning the rocks, the next he was falling, his horse rearing in panic. Before the others could react, a second shot cracked across the valley, then a third. Each round found its mark with devastating precision. Chaos erupted as the gang realized they were under fire. Horses whinnied in terror, riders shouted conflicting orders. Some tried to charge forward, only to have their mounts stumble in the hidden trenches. Others wheeled around, searching frantically for the source of the attack. "There!" Cole shouted, pointing toward the rocks. But Evelyn was already moving, just as she'd practiced. By the time their bullets struck her former position, she was sliding down a prepared path to her second firing point. From this new angle, she picked off those who'd sought shelter behind boulders. Each shot was calculated, deliberate, the product of years of experience. The gang's superior numbers meant nothing against an opponent they couldn't see or reach. Silas's voice cut through the mayhem, ordering a retreat. But Evelyn had anticipated this too. As they turned their horses, more shots rang out, seemingly from multiple directions, her careful positioning creating the illusion of multiple shooters. When the dust settled, 7 of Silas's men lay dead or wounded. The others had fled in disarray, leaving behind weapons and supplies in their panic. Only Silas and Cole remained, taking cover behind a fallen tree, their earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear. "Who is she?" Cole hissed, flinching as another bullet splintered wood inches from his head. Silas didn't answer, his face pale with the realization that they'd grievously underestimated their target. When the next shot shattered his gun hand, his scream echoed across the valley. Cole dragged him onto a horse and they fled, leaving their dead behind. From her position, Evelyn watched them go, her rifle barrel still warm. The message had been sent, written in blood and fear. The widow was not to be trifled with. In the abandoned silver mine, Silas's roar of rage echoed off the cavern walls as the doctor wrapped his shattered hand. Empty bottles littered the ground around him, failed attempts to dull both pain and humiliation. The surviving gang members huddled in corners, their usual bravado replaced by a shell-shocked silence. "How?" Silas demanded, hurling a bottle against the wall. "How did one old woman do this to us?" His face was contorted with a mixture of pain and wounded pride. The fearsome reputation of the Black Vultures, built over years of violence and intimidation, had been shredded in a single morning. Cole paced nearby, his usual cockiness replaced by something darker. "She's not just some widow," he spat. "Those shots, that was military precision. 800 yards, maybe more. Nobody shoots like that unless they've had training." The doctor finished bandaging Silas's hand, stepping back quickly to avoid another outburst. "You're lucky," he muttered. "An inch to the left would have taken your whole hand off." "Lucky?" Silas snarled, rising unsteadily to his feet. 7 of my men are dead. 7. And the rest? He gestured around the cave at his remaining gang members, their faces still pale with fear. Look at them. She's got them spooked like children. A rider burst into the cave, his horse lathered with sweat. Boss, news from town. They're talking about her, calling her Dead-Eye Eve. Some old-timer recognized her shooting style. Says she was some kind of secret sharpshooter during the war. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd heard whispered stories of a mysterious sniper who'd terrorized Confederate forces, but they'd always seemed like campfire tales. All this time, he whispered, she was right there, playing the helpless widow. We could leave, one of the gang members suggested timidly. Find easier territory. The suggestion earned him a bottle to the head. Leave? Silas roared. Run away from one old woman? No, she's just made this personal. He turned to Cole, his eyes blazing with murderous intent. Send word to every branch of the gang. I want every black vulture from here to Mexico. We're going to hit her with everything we have. Cole's face split in a cruel grin. How many men do you figure that'll be? 50, maybe more, Silas replied, a plan forming through his drunken haze. We'll see how good she is against an army. And this time, he held up his bandaged hand. No more playing nice. I want that farm burned to the ground. I want her to watch everything she loves turn to ash before we end her. The cave filled with murmurs of agreement as the gang's confidence began to rebuild. But beneath their renewed bravado, a current of fear remained. They'd witnessed something none of them had expected, a force of nature disguised as a widow, whose true nature they'd discovered far too late. A week after the ambush, Evelyn found him collapsed near her property line. A young man, no more than 25, with a bullet in his shoulder and fever in his eyes. His clothes were trail-worn, his face gaunt with exhaustion. She recognized the look of someone running from something, or someone. Please, he managed to whisper before consciousness slipped away from him. They're coming. Despite her instincts urging caution, Evelyn couldn't leave him to die. She half-dragged, half-carried him back to her house, his blood leaving a trail she'd have to conceal later. Inside, she laid him on her kitchen table, the same place where she'd once tended to wounded soldiers. Hold on, son, she murmured, cutting away his shirt to reveal the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, but infection was setting in. As she cleaned and dressed the injury, she kept her rifle within arm's reach, years of experience having taught her that kindness and caution weren't mutually exclusive. Hours passed before his fever broke. When he finally opened his eyes, they were clear and alert, immediately taking in his surroundings and the rifle propped nearby. Name's Luke, he said, his voice hoarse. I owe you my life, ma'am. You owe me an explanation, Evelyn replied, changing his bandages. Those weren't random robbers after you. You've got the look of someone who knows his pursuers. Luke was quiet for a moment, weighing his words. The Black Vultures, he finally admitted. They tried to recruit me. When I refused, they decided to make an example of me. Evelyn's hands stilled. You're either very brave or very foolish to stand against them alone. Sounds like you'd know something about that, Luke responded, nodding toward her rifle. Word's spreading about what you did to Silas's men. They're calling you Dead-Eye Eve in town. A shadow crossed Evelyn's face. Names don't matter. What matters is standing your ground when the world tries to take what's yours. Luke attempted to sit up, wincing at the pain. They won't stop, you know. Silas is calling in every black vulture in the territory. They're coming back, and this time they'll bring an army. Let them come, Evelyn said quietly, but there was steel in her voice. She studied Luke's face, seeing something familiar in his eyes. The same determination she'd once seen in young soldiers who refused to break. Teach me, Luke said suddenly. I saw your shooting gallery out back. Those targets at impossible distances. Teach me to shoot like you do. Evelyn was silent for a long moment, Memories of another time, another student flooding back. Finally, she spoke. "Can you stand?" Luke nodded, gritting his teeth as he swung his legs off the table. "Good," she said, picking up her rifle. "First lesson starts now. We've got work to do before they return." The sun had yet to rise when Evelyn woke Luke for his first lesson. His shoulder was still tender, but determination overrode the pain as she led him to the shooting range. Morning mist clung to the ground, shrouding the distant targets in a ghostly haze. "First rule," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "The rifle is just a tool. Your mind, your breath, your patience, those are your real weapons." She handed him her old training rifle, watching as he handled it with natural respect. 800 yards, she continued, pointing to a target barely visible through the mist. "That's what separates the living from the dead in a real fight. Anyone can shoot close. Distance is where battles are won." For hours, she drilled him in the fundamentals: proper breathing, trigger control, reading wind conditions. Luke proved to be a quick study, his youth and eagerness balanced by a surprising patience. When he finally made his first long-distance shot, the crack of the rifle was followed by his whoop of triumph. "Good," Evelyn nodded, allowing herself a small smile. "Now do it again 100 times, until it's as natural as breathing." Between shooting sessions, they fortified the property further. Luke's carpentry skills proved invaluable as they constructed hidden firing positions and reinforced existing cover. Every approach to the house was mapped, measured, and prepared for defense. "Thomas would have liked you," Evelyn said one evening as they cleaned their rifles. "He always said the best students are the ones who understand that learning to shoot is really learning to think." Luke looked up, curious. "Will you tell me about him, about the war?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment, her hands never stopping their methodical work on the rifle. "We were scouts," she finally said. "Special operations, they'd call it now. Our job was to protect units from threats they couldn't see coming. One shot, one chance, then disappear like ghosts." "Like what we're preparing for now," Luke observed. "Similar," she agreed, "except this time we're not running after we shoot." Her eyes hardened. "This time we're defending our home." As days turned to weeks, Luke's skills improved dramatically. Soon he was hitting targets at ranges that would have seemed impossible before. But more than shooting, he learned to think like Evelyn, to see the landscape as a weapon, to understand how terrain and timing could multiply their effectiveness. One morning, as they watched the sunrise from the shooting range, Luke broke their comfortable silence. "They're coming soon, aren't they?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Dawn or dusk, those are the likely times. Silas will want the light in his favor." She turned to Luke, her gaze intense. "Are you ready for what's coming? There's no shame in leaving while you can." Luke checked his rifle, his movements sure and confident. "My place is here. You gave me back my life. The least I can do is help you defend yours." First light hadn't yet touched the horizon when Evelyn's hand tightened on her rifle. Through her scope, she could see them coming, dark shapes moving through the pre-dawn gloom. Just as she'd predicted, Silas had chosen dawn for his attack, hoping to use the rising sun to blind any defenders. "I count 47, Luke whispered from his position beside her. They lay concealed in the rocks overlooking the property, their rifles ready. Maybe more still to come. "Silas and Cole will be holding back," Evelyn replied softly. "They'll wait until they think they've got us pinned down." Her voice was calm despite the overwhelming odds. "Remember what I taught you. Make every shot count." The first wave of attackers reached the narrow pass, their confidence evident in their tight formation. Evelyn's finger curled around the trigger, but she held her fire, waiting. Patience had won her more battles than speed ever had. The explosion caught everyone by surprise. The dynamite they'd buried in the past turned the morning into a momentary day, sending horses and riders flying. Before the dust could settle, Evelyn and Luke opened fire, their rifles cracking in deadly harmony. "Shooters in the rocks!" someone screamed. but the gang's return fire went wide. Evelyn and Luke had already shifted positions, moving to their second prepared spot, just as they'd practiced countless times. The battle quickly devolved into chaos. The Black Vultures, expecting an easy target, found themselves caught in a carefully orchestrated killing ground. Every time they tried to advance, precision fire forced them back. When they sought cover, they discovered their hiding spots were already marked for range and elevation. "They're trying to flank us," Luke warned, spotting movement to their left. But Evelyn had anticipated this too. The hidden trenches she'd dug channeled the attackers exactly where she wanted them. "Now," she commanded, and they both opened fire on the trapped riders. The morning air filled with screams and the thunder of panicked horses. Through her scope, Evelyn spotted Silas and Cole finally moving forward, fury evident in their postures. Silas's bandaged hand gleamed white in the growing light as he shouted orders, trying to rally his men. A bullet struck the rock near Evelyn's head, sending fragments flying. Luke returned fire instinctively, his shot dropping the shooter from his horse. The months of training showed in every move he made, each shot deliberate and deadly. "Fall back to position 3, Evelyn ordered, as more bullets filled the air around them. They moved like shadows through their prepared routes, emerging onto the barn's remaining framework. From here, they had clear lines of fire in all directions. The sun was fully up now, revealing the extent of the carnage. Bodies littered the approaches to the house, while wounded men and riderless horses added to the confusion. But still they came, driven by Silas's rage and their own desperate need to prove they couldn't be defeated by a widow and a young drifter. "They're regrouping," Luke observed grimly. "This isn't over." "No," Evelyn agreed, reloading her rifle with practiced ease. "But neither are we." By midday, the battlefield had grown quiet. The surviving Black Vultures had pulled back beyond rifle range, leaving their dead and wounded scattered across Evelyn's property. Through her scope, she watched Silas pacing, his gestures angry as he argued with Cole. "They're planning something," Luke muttered, wincing as he checked the graze wound on his arm. A lucky shot had caught him during their last exchange of fire. "They're running out of options," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite hours of combat. "Silas won't retreat. His pride won't let him. That leaves only one choice." As if summoned by her words, Silas's voice boomed across the property. "Eve, come out and face me. Just you and me, or I'll burn every acre of this land with you on it." To emphasize his point, mounted riders appeared on the ridgelines, each carrying torches. In the dry summer heat, a single spark could turn the whole valley into an inferno. "It's a trap," Luke warned, gripping his rifle tighter. "Let me take the shot." Evelyn shook her head. "No, he's right. This ends between us." She handed Luke her spare ammunition. "Watch the ridges. Don't let them start those fires, no matter what happens down there." Before Luke could protest further, Evelyn was moving. She emerged from cover with fluid grace, her rifle held loosely but ready. Silas stood in the open ground between the house and the rocks, his coat discarded, gun belt prominent on his hip. "Brave of you," he called out as she approached. "Or maybe just stupid." "Says the man who brought an army to fight one widow," Evelyn replied, stopping 30 paces from him. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and blood across the space between them. Silas's face twisted. "You've cost me everything. My men, my reputation." He flexed his bandaged hand. "Time to see how good you are up close." "Last chance to walk away," Evelyn offered, though she knew he wouldn't take it. His draw was lightning fast, even with his injured hand. But Evelyn didn't reach for her rifle or a pistol. Instead, she dropped and rolled as his first shot passed through the space she'd occupied. Her hand came up with Thomas's old Derringer, the one she'd concealed in her sleeve. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Silas's bullet kicked up dust near Evelyn's feet. Hers struck him high in the chest, the impact spinning him halfway around before he collapsed. The silence that followed was deafening. Cole's voice shattered it with a howl of rage as he charged forward, gun blazing. But Luke's shot caught him squarely, dropping him before he could reach Evelyn. From the ridgelines, the remaining black vultures watched their leaders fall. One by one, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving behind their dead and their dreams of conquest. Evelyn stood slowly, her body aching from the day's battles. She looked down at Silas, watching the life fade from his eyes. "You never understood," she told his corpse softly. "Some things are worth dying for, and some people are worth fighting." As the dust settled over Evelyn's property, the true cost of the battle became clear. The ground was littered with spent cartridges, abandoned weapons, and the bodies of those who had underestimated a widow's resolve. The morning's mist had given way to a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional cry of circling vultures, real ones this time. Sheriff Miller arrived with a posse from town, drawn by the sound of gunfire. They found Evelyn and Luke sitting on her porch, rifles across their laps, watching the horizon for any sign of returning riders. The lawman's eyes widened as he surveyed the scene before him. "Good Lord, Mrs. James," he whispered, counting the bodies. "You did all this?" "They did it to themselves," Evelyn replied quietly. "I just showed them the consequences of their choices." The town quickly organized burial parties. As they worked, whispers spread about the true identity of the quiet widow who had lived among them for years. Stories of Deadeye Eve began to circulate, growing with each telling, mixing truth with legend until it was hard to separate one from the other. Luke remained by Evelyn's side as she oversaw the cleanup. His shoulder had healed well, and there was a new confidence in his bearing. Not the false bravado of the black vultures, but the quiet strength that comes from standing your ground. "Word's spreading fast," he told her one evening as they repaired damage to the barn. "Every town between here and Mexico's talking about how you broke the black vultures. People are starting to stand up to what's left of the gang." Evelyn nodded, hammering a nail with precise strokes. Fear only works when people believe they're alone. Sometimes it just takes one person to show them they're not. The neighboring ranchers, who had kept their distance during the gang's reign of terror, now came forward with offers of help. Lumber appeared for repairs, fresh horses to replace those lost in the fighting, hands volunteering to help rebuild. The community, long cowed by violence, found its strength again. Sheriff Miller returned a week later with news. "Last of the black vultures surrendered down in Mesa Creek," he reported. "Seems they lost their appetite for trouble after what happened here. The territory is going to be a different place now." That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evelyn stood at Thomas's grave behind the house. She placed a fresh wildflower on the weathered stone, her hand lingering on the carved letters of his name. "You were right," she whispered, "about everything. About keeping the skills sharp, about being ready, about how the world sometimes needs reminding that strength doesn't always look like people expect." Luke approached quietly, respecting the private moment, but wanting to share news. "Town council's offering you a reward for ending the gang's reign," he said. "What should I tell them?" Evelyn turned from the grave, a small smile touching her lips. "Tell them to use it to build a school. It's time this territory started building something instead of just fighting." 1 year after the battle that broke the black vultures, Evelyn stood in her yard watching Luke teach a group of local ranchers' children proper rifle handling. His voice carried across the morning air, patient and steady, just as hers had been when teaching him. "Remember," he called out, "the rifle is just a tool. Your mind, your breath, your patience, those are your real weapons." The words were familiar, passed down like a treasured heirloom. The valley had changed since that bloody dawn. New homesteads dotted the landscape, families feeling safe enough to settle now that the shadow of gang violence had lifted. The town had grown too, the new schoolhouse standing as a symbol of transformation. Evelyn made her way to the old oak tree where she'd buried her rifle after the fight. She knelt slowly, her fingers tracing the earth that covered her weapon. She hadn't touched it since that day, returning to the quiet life she'd always preferred. But the lessons she'd learned and taught lived on through Luke and others. "You've done good work here," Sheriff Miller said, approaching on horseback. He'd taken to stopping by occasionally, sharing coffee and stories on her porch. Territories changing, civilizing, all because one widow refused to be afraid. Evelyn smiled softly. "Fear's a choice," she replied. "So is standing your ground. I just helped people remember they had that choice." Luke dismissed his students and joined them, his manner reflecting the confidence of a man who had found his purpose. "Got word from Mesa Creek," he reported. "They're starting their own shooting school, teaching folks to protect themselves. They want to know if I'll help set it up." "You should go," Evelyn said, noting the question in his eyes. "What we built here needs to spread. People need to know they can defend themselves, their homes, their future." That evening, as the sun set on another peaceful day, Evelyn sat in her rocking chair watching shadows lengthen across her land. The scars of battle had faded, grass growing over the places where blood had soaked the earth. New life, new beginnings. Luke brought her a cup of coffee, settling beside her. "Never thought one person could change so much," he mused. "You gave this whole territory its courage back." Evelyn shook her head. They always had courage. Sometimes people just need reminding of who they really are. She sipped her coffee, remembering Thomas's words from so long ago. The world doesn't forget how to be violent, but it doesn't forget how to be brave either. As darkness settled over the land she'd fought so hard to protect, Evelyn felt at peace. Her legend would live on, not in the violence she'd mastered, but in the strength she'd helped others find. The widow who became a warrior had finally found her way back to being just a widow again, but one whose quiet strength would inspire generations to come. If you thought this story was intense, you won't want to miss what happens in my next video. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought about Evelyn's incredible journey from widow to legend.